July 1944. Deep in the Texas countryside, beneath a blazing sun, a tall barbed wire fence enclosed what appeared to be a peaceful summer camp. But inside, it wasn't American boys playing baseball. It was German soldiers, men who had once marched under Hitler's banner, now standing in line, not for orders, but for lunch. A soft white bread roll, real butter, even peanut butter, a slice of roast beef, cold milk in glass bottles straight from the farm. One prisoner, only 19 years old, had gained nearly 10 pounds in 2 weeks. He wasn't worried. He was smiling. At that same moment across the Atlantic, American GIs were eating cold rations from tin cans, dodging bullets in the hedgerows of Normandy. So how was it that prisoners of war, Nazi soldiers captured on the battlefield, were living better in American camps than many U.S. soldiers fighting for freedom? What initially seemed like a scandal revealed a strategy more powerful than any weapon. By attempting to break the enemy, America did something no one expected. It fed them, educated them, and treated them with dignity. In doing so, it transformed many of them forever. Why were German POWs sent to America? By early 1943, the tide of war was shifting. The Allies were capturing tens of thousands of Axis soldiers in North Africa, Italy, and soon in France. The British Empire, already stretched thin, faced a problem. Too many prisoners and too little space. Their camps were full. Europe remained a battlefield, and the last place anyone wanted to risk housing hardened Nazis was near home. Washington stepped in. The United States, with its vast open spaces and untouched homeland, became the solution. Over the course of the war, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners, mostly Germans, were shipped across the Atlantic in quiet convoys under heavy guard. By war's end, nearly 1 in every 10 German soldiers captured by the Allies had spent time in an American camp. They were spread across more than 500 facilities, from the pine forests of Georgia to the deserts of Arizona and the frozen plains of North Dakota. Some camps were improvised from old civilian conservation corps buildings. Others were newly constructed to strict military standards. Yet all followed one guiding principle: the Geneva Convention of 1929, America, determined to win not just the war, but the peace, enforced it rigorously. To many Americans, the idea of enemy soldiers walking free on American soil, eating American food, guarded by American troops, felt like an insult. Letters poured into newspapers. Why are we feeding the enemy better than our own boys? One reader asked the Chicago Tribune in 1944, military leaders had a different perspective. If the U.S. treated its prisoners humanely, they reasoned, then perhaps American POWs in Germany would receive better treatment, too. There was another benefit, less often discussed: propaganda. By showing captured Germans the wealth, freedom, and fairness of American life, the U.S. hoped to plant a seed that might someday grow into something stronger than any ideology Hitler could offer. Across rural America, fences went up, guards were posted, and the strangest chapter of the war began. Enemy soldiers living in the heart of the very country they had been trained to destroy. Culture shock and first impressions. They expected cages, beatings, hatred. That's what propaganda back home had promised them. For years, German soldiers had been told that if captured by Americans, they would be tortured, perhaps killed. They were the barbaric capitalists, the mongrel race, as Nazi radio liked to put it. But when the trucks finally stopped at the camps, the German prisoners found something different. Silence, green grass, fresh air, and sometimes even the scent of pine trees. Not a single shouting guard. They were marched in, yes, but not humiliated. They were counted, yes, but not stripped. They were given real beds, blankets, toilets that flushed, and a hot meal. They were then told the rules in English and German, and left alone. That was their first American lesson: dignity. Some prisoners could hardly believe it. Private Karl Heinz Miller, a 19-year-old from Dresden, later wrote in his diary, "I was sure it was a trick. Surely the punishments would start tomorrow." But they never did. Instead, they received toothbrushes, soap, clean water, and time. The camps were often far from towns, surrounded by tall fences, yet inside, the environment was calm, almost mundane. No shouting, no indoctrination, just routine. Some guards even smiled. A few prisoners misinterpreted it as mockery. Others recognized something deeper. Decency. There were other surprises. One camp in Georgia allowed prisoners to attend church on Sundays. Another in Texas let them start a choir. A group of prisoners in Colorado were stunned to see black soldiers guarding them and treating them fairly. This was impossible in Germany, one wrote. We were told these men were animals. Gradually, the myths they had grown up believing, racial superiority, American savagery, Nazi destiny, began to crumble. And all it took was breakfast. Yet for many, it was only the beginning. The biggest shock wasn't their surroundings. It was the food. The first thing they noticed wasn't the beds or fences. It was the bread, soft, white, thickly sliced, unlike anything most had eaten in years. Many German POWs came from cities where rations had reduced them to turnips and sawdust-thick rye. Meat was nearly impossible to find. Butter a memory, eggs reserved for the Nazi elite. Yet now, in captivity, they were eating meals that, by wartime standards, bordered on luxurious. According to U.S. Army regulations, each German POW was allotted roughly 3,500 calories a day, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. That included bread, meat, potatoes, vegetables, fruit, and dessert. They drank milk. They got coffee. In some camps, they even received fresh produce from nearby farms. If local civilians were short on sugar, they sometimes found out the enemy was eating pie. At the same time, American soldiers fighting in Europe were scraping by on field rations that offered less, usually around 2,800 to 3,000 calories per day. The infamous K ration came in a cardboard box with canned meat, processed cheese, powdered lemonade, and a slab of dense chocolate. It was portable, yes, but after a few weeks, many GIs couldn't stomach it anymore. Sergeant Bill Hansen of the 29th Infantry once joked, "If you ate the K ration long enough, you'd surrender just to taste real bread again." And while the GIS trudged through Moudon blood in France, often going days without a hot meal, thousands of captured German troops back in the States were gaining weight. Quite literally, one Army doctor assigned to a P camp in Iowa wrote in a report that the average prisoner put on 5 to 10 pounds in the first month. "They are in better shape now than when they arrived," he observed. "We've had to increase shirt sizes." For some of the prisoners, this was a point of embarrassment. They didn't want their families back home to think they had gone soft. But for others, it sparked something unexpected: gratitude. One young Luftwaffe pilot captured in Italy wrote home, "If this is how the Americans treat their enemies, then perhaps they are not our enemies at all." Even more incredible was how seriously the Americans took this obligation. In one case, when local food shortages affected the delivery of meat, the camp commandant ordered that civilian meals be cut back before those of the prisoners. The logic: if America broke its promise under Geneva, it would lose the moral high ground and possibly risk retaliation against American PS held by the Germans. But beyond the paperwork and policy, food did something deeper. It humanized. In camp mess halls across the country, German soldiers, some die-hard Nazis, some just scared farm boys, sat quietly with trays of warm food. There were no Nazi flags, no speeches, just forks and knives. Some of them hadn't eaten this well even before the war. They weren't being brainwashed. They were being fed, and the food became symbolic. One guard later recalled, "I used to watch them eating. These boys were barely older than my son. They'd smile when the pudding came. I couldn't hate them after that." In a war of theology, bullets weren't the only weapon. Sometimes a peanut butter sandwich said more than any propaganda leaflet. But of course, food was only part of the picture. What truly reshaped these men came later, when they were given not just meals, but books, not just beds, but ideas. Because what happens when the enemy begins to learn how democracy actually works? That's what came next. Facilities, education, and the unexpected freedom inside the fences. Life in an American P camp was still life behind barbed wire. There were guard towers. There were curfews. There were rules. But what shocked many German prisoners was what lay inside those fences. Not more fear, but opportunity. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, prisoners were issued uniforms marked PW in bold black letters. They were expected to follow orders. But within days of arrival, they also discovered the camp had a library. Not just German military manuals or censored newspapers, but books, American books, translated editions of Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway, even textbooks on math, history, and politics. In Georgia, one camp offered English classes. In Colorado, prisoners were taught how to farm using modern American techniques. Some even learned how to drive tractors. And then came something no one expected: discussion groups. PS were encouraged to form clubs, to debate ideas, to read newspapers, sometimes redacted but still informative, and even to vote in internal elections for prisoner representatives. It was culture shock on a grand scale. Sergeant Otto Fischer, a former Hitler youth officer, recalled his disbelief. "We were told Americans were chaotic, undisciplined, ruled by greed. But here they followed the rules, but didn't fear their leaders. They laughed in the mess hall. They argued with their officers. They had freedom. Many prisoners were given jobs, non-military ones, in line with Geneva rules. They built fences, cleaned facilities, or were contracted out to local farmers, factories, or timber companies. They were paid in script, camp currency, and allowed to buy from the camp canteen. Chocolate, cigarettes, razors, toothpaste. Some saved their earnings. Others mailed the goods home, stunning their families with packages from enemy territory. But beyond material comfort, something far deeper was happening. German prisoners began to trust the guards, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When one American guard at a camp in Nebraska lent his personal Bible to a curious P, the act spread. Soon, Bible study groups formed, not by force, but by choice. Some camps even held theater performances and orchestra concerts organized entirely by the prisoners themselves. They weren't becoming American. Not yet, but they were seeing a world beyond Hitler. One where disagreement wasn't punished. One where food wasn't rationed by party loyalty. One where freedom didn't mean chaos, it meant dignity. Some of them resisted. Hardline Nazis among the PS tried to enforce loyalty. In the early years, there were fights, even murders inside the camps. Pro-Nazi prisoners attacking others they considered traitors. But the U.S. military noticed this too. Over time, they began to isolate the most fanatic prisoners, creating segregated camps to prevent Nazi influence from spreading. The rest, they flourished. A young artillery officer named Helmut Schroeder later wrote, "In Germany, I memorized slogans. In America, I asked questions." That transformation, slow, personal, invisible to the outside world, was one of the most powerful weapons of the war. Not a bomb, not a bullet, but the idea that even your enemy, treated with respect, might someday choose your side. And it was only just beginning. Because while ideas were reshaping the mind, reality was about to reshape the soul. In the next few years, thousands of these men would be sent to work alongside American civilians on farms, in factories, in small towns. That was the real test. What happens when the enemy walks freely through your community? POW labor and the enemy workers in American towns. By 1944, America faced a different kind of manpower crisis. Not on the front lines, but at home. With over 12 million Americans in uniform, Factories were short-handed. Farms were desperate for help. The answer came, strangely, from behind barbed wire. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoner of war labor was allowed as long as it wasn't directly related to war production. So, the War Department created a system German POWs could volunteer to work on farms, in canneries, sawmills, even in laundry services and road maintenance. In return, they would be paid a modest wage, 80 cents a day, credited to their accounts, and treated fairly. Thousands signed up. In Iowa, prisoners harvested corn. In California, they picked peaches. In Texas, they built irrigation ditches and baled hay. They wore their PBU uniforms and were guarded. But many local farmers soon realized they didn't need to worry. The men weren't interested in escaping. They were interested in the food. Some were driven to the fields by bus. Others walked with shovels slung over their shoulders, singing old folk songs. Townspeople watched with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. These were the men they'd seen in newsreels goose-stepping in Berlin, bombing London, killing GIs, and now they were hoeing lettuce beside them. And then something strange happened. They started talking. Farmers offered them lemonade on hot days. Wives sent them leftover pie. Kids asked questions, and the prisoners responded cautiously at first, then more freely. They showed pictures of their families. Some of them apologized for the war, even if they didn't say it directly. One P named Gunter wrote to his mother in Bavaria, "Today, an American woman gave me cookies. Her son is in Italy fighting Germans, and still she gave me cookies." Not every community accepted them. In some places, fear lingered. Rumors spread. People locked their doors. But over time, routine turned fear into familiarity, and familiarity into something harder to define. In towns like Aliceville, Alabama, or Salina, Kansas, the enemy began to look less like a threat and more like a neighbor. Guards relaxed. Rules softened. In a few rare cases, farmers invited prisoners to Christmas dinner. They sang carols. They laughed. One group of PS in Minnesota even built toys for local orphanages in their spare time. To some Americans, it felt wrong. They wrote angry letters to newspapers. "Are we making friends with murderers?" But others saw it differently. One farmer in Nebraska told a reporter, "I lost a son in France, and I still gave those boys a warm meal. Hate won't bring him back." Not every prisoner felt remorse. Some clung to Nazi ideology. But for many, the kindness they received was transformative. These weren't just enemy soldiers anymore. They were men. And some of them, for the first time in their lives, were being treated as such. The line between captive and citizen began to blur, not legally, but emotionally. And while the war still raged over seashore in the quiet heartland of America, a different kind of battle was being won. Not with tanks, with trust. American soldiers' resentment when the enemy ate better than the hero. Not everyone was smiling. While German prisoners were gaining weight in well-run camps, enjoying hot meals, and earning pocket change working on farms, American GIs were freezing in foxholes, surviving on rations that could barely be called food. And word started to spread when soldiers came home on leave and saw PWS lined up at camp cantons buying cigarettes and candy bars with money they had earned in America. The reaction was instant disbelief, followed by anger. Private Thomas Gleason, a machine gunner with the 4th Infantry Division, wrote in a letter to his wife, "I stood there in uniform, still muddy from France, and watched a German P laugh with the guard like they were friends. He was eating fresh fruit. I hadn't seen an orange in months." The resentment wasn't just emotional, it was systemic. Reports began circulating that German prisoners were getting more calories per day than frontline American troops. Though the difference was based on physical labor and Geneva rules, it felt like betrayal. The man who tried to kill you yesterday was now resting comfortably in your hometown while you were still fighting and bleeding overseas. Newspapers picked it up. One 1944 headline read, "Axis prisoners live in comfort, while American boys starve at the front." Editorials questioned the logic. Letters poured in from angry parents. "My son is in the Pacific," one mother wrote, "and he eats cold beans. Why is the man who bombed London getting steak?" The U.S. War Department responded carefully. Officials pointed to the Geneva Convention and the long-term strategy. Treat their prisoners well, and maybe ours will be treated better in return. And it wasn't just about law. It was about leverage. It was about leverage. If news spread in Germany that the Americans abused their captives, Hitler's propaganda machine would feast on it, and American PS in German hands could pay the price. But logic didn't always calm emotion. Some returning soldiers even got into shouting matches with guards at P camps. One sergeant from New Jersey reportedly refused to deliver supplies to a camp in Mississippi, saying, "Let the Nazis starve a little. Maybe they'll understand what they did." And yet, amidst the frustration, there was something more complicated. Some American guards formed bonds with the prisoners. They saw how young they were, how scared. Many had been conscripted at 16 or 17. One GI who served as a camp cook recalled, "They reminded me of my little brother. Only difference was the uniform." This tension between justice and compassion, between anger and duty, ran through every aspect of the P experience. It was never simple. These were men who had, in some cases, committed atrocities, but they were also human. And for America, the challenge was to remain America even in the face of its enemies. In the end, this internal conflict among U.S. troops revealed something deeper. The war wasn't just being fought overseas. It was being fought inside each soldier between the desire for vengeance and the ideals they were told they were fighting for. From Nazi believers to American dreamers. At first, many of them still believed not in America, not in freedom, but in the Reich, the Führer, the ideology they'd been raised on since childhood. Especially the younger ones, those who had grown up with Hitler Youth songs, swastika flags in their classrooms, and textbooks that taught them Germans were destined to rule the world. But something began to change. Not all at once and not for everyone. But for many German PS, captivity in the United States didn't feel like defeat. It felt like awakening. They were given time to pause, to reflect, to breathe. And with that pause came cracks in their worldview, cracks in the narratives they had been told. At one camp in Texas, a group of POWs were shown American war films. At first, they laughed at them, dismissing them as childish propaganda. But over time, the laughter faded. What stood out wasn't the explosions, it was the people. The way American soldiers questioned authority. The way they fought for one another, not for glory. In Kansas, a prisoner named Deere discovered a copy of the Federalist Papers in the camp library. He didn't understand most of it, but the notion that leaders could be bound by law fascinated him. In Germany, he later said, the Führer served the law. In America, the law serves the Führer. The transformation wasn't forced. There were no re-education sessions, no lectures, only exposure to free press, music, and debate. Some POWs heard jazz for the first time. Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Ella Fitzgerald. To them, it sounded like freedom, and for many, it was infectious. Surveys conducted by the U.S. Army between 1944 and 1945 revealed that nearly 50% of German POWs in American camps began questioning Nazi ideology after 6 months. By war's end, that number had climbed even higher. They began discussing democracy not as a weakness, but as a strength. They debated ethics. Some even wrote essays comparing German and American systems. One camp in Illinois held mock elections. Prisoners voted not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, to feel what it was like. The ideological shift became so pronounced that American officials established a special program called the Intellectual Diversion Section, designed to distribute reading material, organize discussions, and quietly, subtly, allow truth to chip away at lies. And it worked, not because guards shouted, but because the world beyond the fences whispered a different story. a story of opportunity, fairness, and a life not ruled by fear. One POW summed it up best. Years later, in a memoir, he wrote, "Hitler gave me orders. America gave me questions. And with questions, I became a man." This was more than a change of mind. It was a change of identity. The same men who once marched under a swastika now found themselves admiring Roosevelt's America, not out of obligation, but because deep down they hoped their country might one day resemble this one. The war ended, but they didn't want to leave. A strange loyalty lingered. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The European war was over. Across the United States, church bells rang, flags waved, families wept with relief. But inside the POW camps, the mood was complex. Some prisoners cheered, others stood silently. A few broke down in tears, not out of defeat, but because they understood what was coming. Repatriation. The long journey back to a homeland in ruins, a country they no longer recognized, a system many no longer believed in. They had arrived as enemies, fists clenched, full of anger and pride. But after months, sometimes years, under American care, eating American food, reading American books, even working alongside local farmers, they had changed, and leaving was bitter. At Camp Aliceville in Alabama, over 200 German POWs signed a petition pleading to remain in the United States. In Texas, a group reportedly wept as their train departed. Some had formed friendships. A few had fallen in love from afar, with local girls who smiled through fences or passed notes hidden in laundry. But the rules were clear. By 1946, repatriation began in earnest. German POWs were shipped out in waves, returned to a homeland altered beyond recognition. Some found family, others returned to rubble. But what they carried with them was more than memory. It was perspective. Many had seen, for the first time, a government that respected its people, encouraged debate, and nourished its prisoners instead of breaking them. That experience rippled through post-war Europe. A surprising number of returning POWs became teachers, mayors, journalists. Some helped establish new political parties in West Germany. Others taught their children English or preserved photographs of the American towns where they had labored. A few even immigrated years later, legally becoming U.S. citizens, not for convenience, but out of conviction. One former prisoner, Ernst, returned to Texas in 1965 to visit the farm where he had once worked. He found the farmhouse and knocked on the door. The farmer's grown daughter recognized him instantly. They wept. She brought out a photo he had sent in 1947, smiling in front of a row of pumpkins. "You were the enemy," she said, "but you were kind." Ernst replied, "You were supposed to hate me, but you fed me, and that's why I came back." For the U.S., the moral gamble had succeeded. In choosing not to humiliate their enemies, America had done something more potent. It had transformed them. Today, the old guard towers are gone. Fences have rusted. Most camps were dismantled or reclaimed by farmland. Yet in places like Nebraska, Georgia, Texas, and Utah, traces remain, etched in soil, photographs, family stories. In Salina, Utah, a small stone monument marks a tragedy. When a guard opened fire on sleeping German prisoners, 9 died. The town never forgot. But neither did it forget what came after. Local residents raising funds for gravestones, the mayor writing letters of apology to grieving families in Germany, and Americans honoring the dignity of life. In towns like Aliceville and Hearne, stories persist of enemy soldiers picking peaches or building furniture for churches. Some of these relics remain in town halls and homes, a quiet testament to when compassion interrupted conflict. Former prisoners remembered. Some returned decades later. Others named children Lincoln or Franklin. A few became vocal defenders of democracy in Cold War Europe, not because they were forced, but because they were treated as men, not animals, not monsters. This story, does not erase their past. Some were true believers in Hitler's war. Some bore blood on their hands. But in America, they were not tortured or starved. They were fed, sheltered, given books, music, and space to ask, what if everything I believed was wrong? In that space, something remarkable happened. Freedom proved stronger than fear. Not every man changed. Not every heart softened. But thousands did. Not because America demonstrated power, but because it demonstrated mercy.